Hello and welcome to Weekend Watch Repair. My name is Adam. This is the repair and assembly video for the Seiko Pogue, and we're going to start off by installing a jewel in place of the missing minute recording wheel bearing in the chronograph bridge. The chronograph bridge from the Pogue is on top, and on the bottom here I have a spare part I had in stock that I wanted to use to show you an example of what that bearing actually looks like. Here we have the replacement jewel for the minute recording wheel, and these jewels have two sides. One side is flat and the other side is concaved. You always want to make sure when you're installing these, there's the flat side. You can see when the light hits it right. The flat side always is going to need to go towards the part, towards the pinion. The concave side will act as an oil sink for the lubrication. So what we're going to do here is just place it in this hole and just gently kind of barely press it in. We're not pressing it in hard. We're just pretty much getting it set to where it won't move when we transfer it over to the jeweling tool. So I apologize for the quality of the video here on the jeweling tool. This is in really close, and I was holding the tool kind of at a 45-degree angle so the camera could get a good shot of it. So it's shaky at times. But you have an anvil on the bottom, a stump on the bottom, and a pusher on the top, and you push it in, and there's about a 0.01 difference in size. The jewel is about 0.01 millimeters larger than the hole in its friction fit. So once that one's pressed in, we are removing the bushing for the intermediate minute recording wheel, and we just verify the flat versus concave side on that jewel and press it in as well. So here it is fit, and we are going to move on and begin with the barrel jewel upgrade, starting with the barrel bridge. This one here has a bushing in place of a jewel originally, so we just press that bushing out just using a larger pusher and stump on the jeweling tool, and it comes out quite simply. Not really super complicated to do this particular upgrade. So now we're just going to fit in the replacement jewel here. This one here is simply the same thing. The jewel is about 0.01 millimeters larger than the hole in the bridge, and that is what it's held in by, is just the friction from being press fit in. So we just basically get the jewel started, lightly pressing on it, just very lightly. And again, it's just really enough so the jewel doesn't kind of come off when you're transferring it over to the jeweling tool. Here, I press it in initially, and usually on these barrel bridge jewels, I like to press them in flush with the back side of the plate as a starting point, but it didn't go down deep enough, so I put a smaller stump in there that has it's not as wide as the bridge, as the hole in the bridge. So when I press the jewel down, it's going to come down and touch that stump and should be level with the underside of the barrel bridge. So here, after resetting it again, there's a couple different views, but now you can see where this is the underside of the bridge. That's the side that the gear train is on, and it sits. Yeah, that's a really good view there. It basically sits just flush with that, and that's a good starting point, because after we set all these jewels, we still have to test in shake on everything, and there will be some adjustments, raising them or lowering them depending upon what's needed. So the next part is we are going to do the jewel upgrades on the main plate for the lower barrel arbor. And so with that, there's no bushing to press out. We have to remount the hole in the main plate. The diameter of that jewel is 1.60 millimeters. So we are reaming a 1.59 millimeter hole, taking that original hole and widening out. So you can see 1.59 on that reamer. So we're using the sights tool here, and this is edited way down. It's kind of a long process to do this, probably about 15 minutes or so. I generally go very slow, but one helpful hint if you're doing these is to get a stump on your jeweling tool that's exactly 6 millimeters wide, and that sits in perfectly in a recess on that main plate and allows it to not really move around while you're running that reamer. So once we've got the hole reamed out, we need to basically deburr it. I have a little deburring tool here, and we just do this here. You don't need much. You just basically need to just basically deburr the edges just to remove anything around there. I actually, tool was extremely sharp. It kind of surprised me, and I took out a bit more material than I needed to, but it doesn't hurt anything. So once that hole's reamed out and deburred, we fit that jewel in there and press it in just like we've done all the others. So after this jewel got pressed in, I was beginning to do close inspection on all the parts before cleaning. None of these parts have been through cleaning yet. So during inspection, I came across this. This is the lower center wheel jewel in the main plate, the jewel in the very center of the main plate, and there's two cracks in it. I didn't know this was there during disassembly, so this is yet another jewel we had to fix. Thankfully, that particular jewel in this movement is that part is shared among several different models in Seikos. So I thankfully didn't have to order a part. I had a parts movement, a Seiko 6309A, that shared the exact same lower center wheel jewel as this 6319. So I pulled that jewel out, and we're going to use it in here. That one's in good shape. I'm just pressing it down with a bit of pegwood here, and we're going to seat this jewel also. So we're pressing this one in just like we've done all the others, and will have to check in shake on this center wheel as well. And this one here did need some adjustment actually after we got it pressed in, but that's a really tight view on that. I had to use image stabilization on a lot of this footage because I'm holding it at an angle, and even though I thought my hand was steady enough, when you're in that close, the video was super shaky. So that's why it kind of looks odd when we're in that close, but it's still viewable. So I did a very basic clean on these parts here, nothing too thorough, but I ended up having to adjust that. The end shake on that was a little light to begin with, so I actually had to press that center wheel jewel down in a hair deeper to get the amount of end shake that I wanted. So here I am assembling, putting in the barrel, putting in the chronograph wheel, and we're going to put the bridge on so that we can test the end shake on the upper for the barrel. Here I'm just checking it a little bit. I didn't bother with adding in the footage of me doing all the screws and everything because you're going to see all that later during assembly. But I am checking the in shake and side shake of the barrel. The in shake was actually really good. I didn't really have to do any adjustments. And the side shake, I have a closer view here that you can kind of see the side shake on this. Just that tiny amount there is what you're looking for. I heard a deal once that explained it really well, where they said you need as little as possible, but some. So, and that's kind of the guide I've always used on those barrels. We're showing you kind of the underside there, where you can see that lower jewel that we replaced. So now we still need to check the in shake on the chronograph, the minute recording wheel and the intermediate minute recording wheel jewels that we replaced. So we're installing those two wheels here on the barrel bridge, and we'll put the chronograph plate on here. So the first thing I do here, we're going to kind of get a close, tighter shot in here so you can kind of see that. The first thing I do is just move the wheels a little bit and just kind of get the feel for it. And this one does feel tight. I can tell that something is kind of off here. So the first thing we do is check the in shake on this minute recording wheel, and that's pretty good. That's not a lot of movement, but we're in real close. It looks like a lot. When I started moving the minute recording wheel here, I could definitely tell this was the problem because this had absolutely zero up and down movement. And it was just definitely way too tight. So I went ahead and pulled all the parts off and reset that jewel in a little bit deeper. And here is it reassembled again. And now I moved it. And it's hard to tell in the video, but there is a very light amount of movement, but just enough. But now when I spin it, I can immediately tell that it spins much more freely. It feels correct. And now with all that jeweling work done, All the parts went through a very thorough cleaning, and now we're down to the assembly of the watch. The first thing I like to do during assembly is to get the mainspring barrel completely sorted. And on the automatic watch, that begins with lubrication of the sidewalls with the braking grease. On these particular watches, Seiko recommends using their S4 grease. It's that black grease we referenced earlier, and we put some of that along the edges of the barrel, making sure that we don't get any on the actual uh, that it remains on the sides of the barrel. So we're installing a brand new replacement mainspring. These come pre-lubricated, so we don't have to lube that. So we use this washer here, and I'm using some brass tweezers to make sure I don't mark up the spring. And there you can see that spring drop in. I'm just keeping it held down pretty firmly just to make sure that when everything is seated in correctly so it doesn't spring out. So once that's done, we install the barrel arbor next. I I like to get the hook in first and then rotate it in. Some people will uh, put the barrel arbor in and then rotate it around to where that hook engages on the arbor. Uh, I would probably do that if I had a barrel arbor vise, but I don't, so I do it that way. So here I'm using a little bit of HP 1300 lubricant to lubricate the shoulder on the barrel arbor where it's going to make contact with the top plate here. And actually that's the underside bottom plate because what you see here, that side actually faces downwards when it's in the watch. So we use this little cap here that just puts even pressure on that lid when it presses it in. And I'm using a bit more HP 1300 here to lubricate that shoulder on the other side of that. And capillary action will pull that oil into that shoulder. The next thing we're going to do here is get the upper and lower balance jewels completely cleaned and lubricated. So I mount the balance onto the main plate here. I used to run these attached through my cleaner, and it did a good enough job. But any more, I like to just take the pallet fork and the balance and clean them in one dip, which is a cleaning solution. It's a lot less violent process than running them through the cleaning machine, and with one dip, there's also no chance in dissolving the shellac for the impulse jewel or the pallet fork. So after some time soaking and a little bit of scrubbing on the jewels, and then re-soaking again in one dip, we have them all clean and ready to go. So now we just make sure we have the flat side of the capstone facing upward, and we'll put the chaton. I believe that's probably what it's called. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I like using an automatic oiler. I recently picked this up, and it's just so much easier to oil those jewel settings with those. If you're on the fence about getting one, I'd highly recommend it. Once you get the oiler kind of set up properly to dispense the right amount of oil, it's pretty great. Instead of really trying to put that single dot on those capstones by hand. So now we're going to put the shock spring back in place. With these, these aren't these are far from the worst ones I've ever done. Actually, these are generally pretty easy to do. I like using two fine tip tweezers, although they don't look really fine tip in the video because we're in so close. But just very light pressure until you get at least two of those ends in where it'll hold in place. But after we get that in and turned and locked down, we'll just clean it up with a little bit of Rodico, and we begin with the exact same process on the other side. So we remove these, and then I've lost more of those springs trying to handle them with tweezers, so I just use Rodico to remove those. Um, Using a little bit of Rodico to remove the jewel, the capstone came out by itself, and so then we remove the inner part there and soak those also in one dip here. Uh, I kind of kept this in the video here just so you can kind of see what I'm using, just a little benzene jar. So a little bit of cleaning and further scrubbing. You just make sure the light hits it right like you see there to make sure it's clean. And we assemble the jewels just like before. Once you get it on there, we just oil it again. Again, I'll use the automatic oiler here, and it just puts just the right amount of oil on there. A lot of times I like to use tweezers to make sure that jewel stays in place. But here you see that little circle kind of about that covers 50% of the inner 50% of that. That's the oil ring, and that's really what you're looking for is just about that amount of oil. So once that's in place, we put this spring in just like the previous one. Just using very light pressure, very light pressure. So if that spring does go flying, it will not fly very far. So this one here, it took me a little bit longer to kind of get this one started. Sometimes they can be a little bit troublesome, but this one was not too bad. So I'm kind of holding pressure down here on that third one because you kind of have to give it a little bit of downward pressure to make sure the end of that spring goes inside that lip. But once you get it in there, everything's in place. The next thing I like to do is just use a little puff of air, and I have this edited down, but I look for these to spin for at least 30 to 45 seconds on their own after they're oiled, and that one went for a little over 60 seconds. So everything was good on the balance, and now we're going to begin with the actual assembly of the watch, which we begin with the center wheel or the second wheel, depending upon what you want to call it. So I like oiling the pivots on the gears rather than the jewels. It's a little bit you get a little bit less oil traveling to other places. At least I find I do when I do it that way. So we assemble that, and then we put the center wheel bridge on, which is attached by one screw. What isn't shown here, I also oiled the other side of that watch for the part on the wheel that contacts the bearing. It just didn't get in the video. But again, so this is final assembly. I'm just double checking and triple checking in shake just to make sure that everything is still where we want it. I had oiled the arbors on the barrel kind of off camera before I put it in. So a lot of times that's kind of done once the parts are assembled up. And I've done it both ways. It really works either way, but I had oiled that one off camera. So with the barrel in, we put the third wheel in, the infamous third wheel that I had kind of talked about my history on in the previous video, but that's in. And so now we're on to the escape wheel. So when you're doing these escape wheels, and I mean, this rule applies to everything, but that escape wheel is just so small. Just make triple sure you've got that pivot in that jewel down there and it's oriented correctly. So now it's time to do the chronograph wheel, and we need to do a little bit of special lubrication on this. So, and this is a really odd filming angle, but you press down on the pinion, but not on that kind of that inner bushing that you see there. You press down on that pinion and get a little bit of distance, and then you take a little bit of 90-10, and capillary action will pull that lubrication in between that pinion and that bushing. But that's kind of how you oil those. It's kind of an awkward process and really awkward to film. Once that's done, we're just going to oil the pinion on that chronograph wheel, and then that thing can go in place here. Just kind of be very careful. You're putting that thing in straight, and just kind of let gravity bring it in. Don't really press down on those, but just be very light. That's such an expensive part to replace if you break it. So the next thing to go on is the barrel bridge. Again, we had already pre-lubricated the barrel arbor, so that's why you're not going to see me lubricate that like you'd probably seen a lot of other videos. So a little tip here, I caught from a watchmaker that was on YouTube. He talked about he was working on a 6138 dual register chronograph Seiko, and he would put that bridge on and then tap his movement holder a bit, and that aligned all the pivots in there. And I've used that trick ever since I saw him do that, and it works on about 60% of the watches I've worked on. But that got all the pivots in line, and there's really only two pivots that need to be in line, is the third wheel and the escape wheel on these until you get the chronograph bridge on. But it aligned all those pivots, and just that's one of the things that's a major pain in the neck sometimes when you're doing watch repair, is getting your pivots aligned. And granted, there's not a lot to align at this stage on this particular movement, but that little tapping trick is just fantastic. So I did not come up with that. I stole that after I saw someone do it on video, and I have used it ever since. So now we are putting the screws on the barrel bridge, and I'm not tightening them down fully. Just we got them barely tight, and I was just double checking to make sure everything spins fully. And then once that's done, we'll go through and we make sure that all the wheels turn. So when you're working on these 6138 and 31 or 6139 movements, it's okay if you go to turn that and the wheels don't turn. Right now, without that chronograph bridge on there, there's nothing on the pivot on that chronograph wheel. So the gears may not turn, but that doesn't mean they're not in their pivots. This one did, and so I was able to check it by spinning it. But it's okay if they don't. But if they don't, you just make triple sure that everything's where it should be. So there's a cover plate for the intermediate minute recording wheel, so that covers the third wheel and the escape wheel jewels. Well, that's a bearing, not a jewel. But we're going to oil those with 9010 before we install that plate. This plate is where the lower pivot for the intermediate minute recording wheel rests. So, which we do not lubricate that particular wheel, top or bottom. But that is held on by one screw. And once that's done, we're going to move on to the click spring. The click spring is held on by one screw. In my experience, sometimes those have been kind of difficult to get started because that click spring likes to move around. But this one here decided to cooperate and went on very simply. So after that is done, the next thing we have is the ratchet wheel. Ratchet wheel is held on by one single screw. That screw is unique in the watch. There's no other place on there that shares that same particular screw. So we get this tightened down, and you can only really get it tightened so far before it starts to turn the barrel and subsequently the wheel train. So what I like to do is just use that little plastic tool I have just to put a little pressure on the side of it so that I can get a little bit of torque on that screw to tighten it down. So once that's done, I just clean up a little this things with Rodico, and now we're lubricating for the post for the column wheel bushing. That's that tiny little bushing that is easy to misplace and easy to lose in like a mesh cleaning basket. I really have to make sure that I don't forget those. So once that bushing's on, then we put a tiny bit of lubrication. In this instance, I'm putting HP 1300 on there, just a little tiny bit. And I like to put a little bit of grease on this spring here that interacts with that. You may say that's a huge deal of grease on my oiler, but I only use a tiny bit of it, but it kind of allows me to just place the amount that I want in the right spot. I don't actually use all of that. So once that wheel's in, I'll use a little bit of Rodico to clean up some of that grease, and we'll do that again before this whole thing is done. The column wheel is secured in place by one screw. Once that screw gets tightened down, then we move on to lubrication of the column wheel. These column wheels have both horizontal and vertical teeth on there, or the vertical ones are really posts more than teeth, but I'm lubricating some specific points on both the horizontal and vertical points on there. And then once that's done, I clean it up a little bit with Rodico just to start, which we'll see here. Yeah, here we go. But once the rest of the parts get put in place where we can rotate that around, I'll go through and do further touch up on that just to make sure that there's remove all the excess lubrication. Next, we are installing the first and second coupling levers. This one here is the second coupling lever, and so that point that it rotates around, it looks like a flathead screw, but that is an eccentric pin. That pin is used to adjust the engagement of those coupling levers into the clutch ring of the chronograph wheel. So as a general rule, if you don't touch it, it doesn't need to be adjusted. But sometimes people get in there and turn those screws thinking they're screws, and it can kind of throw your adjustments out of whack until you get in there and fix it. But the manual has some pretty good detailed info on that. So we use those, tighten them down with those two screws. Once that's in place, there's just a little bit of lubrication needed where those two coupling levers meet up, and I'm just greasing that point there. Then I'll work those two levers a little bit to get that grease situated where it needs to be. And once that's done, I'll go through and just kind of touch up and clean up the excess lubrication off those levers with just some Rodico. Once that's all cleaned up, now we're going to install the operating lever spring. That's the spring in the original video that I had kind of three-quarters of it was off camera, so I want to make sure that you guys really saw the spring. Uh, I like to hold it down just with a little bit of pressure on my finger. Not a lot of pressure, just a tiny bit, but it just kind of keeps it from flying off. But once I get it set in place on that second coupling lever, I'll just use my tweezers here and get that set in place just like that, making sure that all those points are in there before I remove my finger. Once that's done, now I'm going to lubricate the striking faces of the chronograph hammer. I'm just using 9010 on here. Uh, Video was a tiny bit fuzzy there. Sorry about that, but you can kind of see that lubrication going on there. And it's just a little bit. You could also lubricate the heart on the chronograph wheel and the minute recording wheel, but it essentially does the same thing. I just like doing it this way. So the rotation point where that hammer rotates around that pivot, that also looks like a flathead, but that is another eccentric pin. You can use to adjust that hammer as needed. Next is the hammer spring. Here I'm going to use that. I use my finger normally, but I decided to use this tool here just so you could kind of see it a little bit better. This is an odd shaped spring. This is that one I had talked about in my original video where I had one go flying on me once. And so I'm always extremely careful when I'm doing one of these. But once that spring gets held in place, just like that, that hammer is good to go. This next part's not in the manual, but I like using a very tiny amount of 9010 on the contact points on these springs here. I don't show every single contact point on video getting lubricated. There's one or two that I left off, but that is metal on metal contact, and it is moving slightly, so I just use a very tiny amount of lubrication. There was some smudge marks on the hammer, so I'm cleaning that up. And for those of you that were looking earlier and saw that little piece of fiber or something on the ratchet wheel, I did clean that up. It was driving me nuts when I was editing the video, and I did see it, but it did get cleaned up. So now we're installing the minute recording wheel and intermediate minute recording wheel. Once those are in place, the chronograph bridge can go on next. These can be a little bit tricky sometimes to install, mainly because of that hammer click spring, the that little arm with the little hook you see at the lower end of the bridge. That's basically in the way of getting this bridge set in place until you get that in place. But it's just kind of a little tricky operation. But once we make sure the pivots are in place, I hold a little bit of pressure down and I'll set that spring in place. We'll lubricate it here in a minute, but I just like to make sure that, there we go. Now you saw that bridge really fall down and set in place. I'll just double check everything just by rotating those wheels and making sure that all those pivots are in place and that everything feels correct. So this bridge is held down by 3 screws. I like to keep pressure, very light pressure, and I mean very light, but just enough to keep the plate from moving around. So I'll get in at least 2 screws on here before I release pressure on that plate. Just wanting to make sure that nothing moves around, especially because this also has the jewel for the chronograph wheel, and we just want to make sure that nothing gets moved around, nothing changes, and just the slightest amount of change can bend a pivot. So we just want to be very careful. Once all 3 screws are in place and we confirm everything is seated, we'll go down and just make sure everything is torqued down properly. Once that's done, I'll just clean up a few things here with Rodico, just as a final once over for everything. So now I'm putting a little bit of grease on the hammer click spring. If you find that when you're doing these and the reset button's really difficult to press in, especially at first, that is where you make the adjustment on, it adjusting that hammer click spring in or out will make that button easier or harder to press. But once that plate's on and everything's in, we can cycle the chronograph around. I did it several times and worked that grease around in the column wheel and then cleaned it up afterwards also. But once that's in place, now we can move on to the pallet fork. So we get that pallet fork set, and now we're putting the pallet fork bridge in place. When you do this, use very light pressure, and I mean very light pressure. Even if it takes you a little while, do not force anything on these. Those pivots on that pallet fork, I'm convinced they're looking for any excuse they can to break. So just don't give it that opportunity. But once we get that down and make sure all the pivots are in place and that thing moves, we screw down the pallet fork bridge. This one here is held on by these 2 screws. And, I was just thinking while you see me putting these two screws in, there is uh, a little bit of grease applied and specific lubrication points on that hammer as well. And that was done. It just wasn't shown on the camera earlier. So now with that pallet fork in place, we can now put a little bit of wind in the mainspring in this watch. And once we have that, we're just checking the pallet fork here just to make sure that that is working properly. And now this is the tightest shot in the entire video. We're going to be doing the lubrication of the exit stone and oiling the escapement on this watch. There was a tiny bit of Rodico here, and it was driving me crazy. And there's another piece right on that barrel bridge, so I had to take care of those. I saw those under the microscope, and it drove me crazy. So there's 15 teeth on this escape wheel. So what we'll do is lubricate the face of that pallet jewel, and then rotate that around and apply that grease to 5 teeth at a time. And then we'll come in here with a little bit better focus now, and apply a dab of grease. This is a special grease for the escapement. You can see I got some on the top of that stone. If this was oil, I would have pulled the part and cleaned it. But this grease really doesn't travel that well. So, I mean, it will not hurt a thing here. But we repeat this process 3 times and oil the escapement around. So we'll get the 5 teeth here. And then after that, we just work it around a little bit. And once the balance goes in, it's good to go. There was one more tiny little piece of stuff there. So here I'm installing the balance, and I will be the first to admit I got lucky. I've put in a bunch of balances, and that one was far and away the absolute quickest I have ever done it. I honestly couldn't believe it when I put it in, and I mean, it went right into place and fired right up, and it does not get any easier or I think luckier than that. So I'm going to take that win. So the balance is held on by 2 screws. I like to, with that balance running, it always makes me nervous having a screwdriver there, because in case I slip, the last thing you obviously want to do is drive your screwdriver down into that running balance, or even not running for that matter. So if I can start those screws with my tweezers, I generally do. But once that's in, we'll tighten those up, and I usually let these run for 15 or 20 minutes just to let that lubrication in the escapement really work its way in. And then we go to the initial timegrapher reading. Now, I'd done an initial reading and just fixed beat rate a little bit. And again, this is only right now just testing in one position. But this is an exceptional reading. I mean, it's generally, you see a lot more movement in that line, but this is probably for that watch has probably been running for 30 to 40 minutes at this point. But yeah, this is a great starting point. Amplitude's good. It's going to rise a bit over the next few days, but that was a great starting point. So now we begin with the assembly of the dial side of the watch, and we begin here with the clutch wheel. So I am lubricating with some grease here the point where the yoke is going to interact with that clutch wheel. Now I'm putting some HP 1300 on a few points here. That point was where the intermediate wheel is going to be, and now I'm lubricating the point for the minute wheel. This here is I'm putting a little bit of grease here in the hole where the setting lever is going to go. Just kind of rotating that around a little bit to spread it out. And now we're going to install the setting lever. Takes me a minute just to kind of get this thing in place. You have to make sure a few of the levers are in the right orientation. But once that's in, I just get that in, move it around a little bit, and we're a little bit more 1300 here on the where the yoke and yoke spring, which is all in one part, where that's going to go. So we get that put in place. Now I am going to move that yoke around and just press it down just a little bit to where it engages with that clutch wheel. Next up, we use a little bit of grease and lubricate the edge of that yoke. There's 2 contact points here where it's going to interact with the setting lever. And so I'll just use that high friction grease and do it that way. But that yoke came undone there, so I'm just resetting it again. I'm also going to apply a little bit of grease to the edge of that spring where it engages with the main plate. Next up, I am greasing the contact point where the setting lever spring is going to interact, and also using that same grease on the opposite contact point on the setting lever itself. I like doing it this way. It's a lot easier to lubricate it before you install it. I think so. I mean, it works both ways. There's really not a wrong way to do it as long as you do lubricate it. But now we're going to install the setting lever, and that one just fell right into place. That setting lever is held in by 2 screws. Just when you put these in, a lot of times that setting lever won't just drop right into place. You have to loosen, get the setting lever spring put in before you can fully torque it down. But this one here, it just because of the orientation where the clutch wheel is, it just fell right into place because the setting lever is in the outermost point. One thing I missed, I should have lubricated the rear side of that setting lever, but I'm doing it here. It's just a little bit more difficult, but it's just because I didn't want to take the parts off to do it again. But once all that's done, I just use a little bit of Rodico and clean up a lot of the just the excess grease off of everything. Now we are lubricating the stem. Right there is where it's going to get engaged with the setting lever in that little recess. And then there's 4 points. I put a little bit of grease on each of the flat sides where it's going to go inside that clutch wheel. Kind of a tedious process, and it doesn't take much grease, but you just want to make sure that's well lubricated and properly done. Once that's done, just a little bit right there on the tip. So there's something I neglected to mention in the original video. On these Seiko 6139s, there is a known issue with reinstalling the stem in these. And it's because if you press down on the setting lever and remove the stem when it's in the outward position in the time setting position, that can cause some of the parts in the keyless works to fall out of position where the stem will come out, but does not want to go back in and get set into place. So in order to fix it, you basically have to tear the watch down till you can get access to the keyless works basically to this point, and then reset a few items in place. So make sure if you remove the stem on a 6139, the crown is in the inward position. Even though there is no manual winding in this watch, but in the winding position, it'll fully sit in. That'll just save you a lot of headache later. So now that we've got a few points here lubricated, we are going to install the date corrector spring. The date corrector spring is held on by this single screw. This is a spring that's under quite a bit of tension, as mentioned in the disassembly video. So what we'll do here is just get the screw started, close to being all the way in, but not fully. And then we can set the spring in place, put tension on it. And you'd seen just while I was talking about the stem earlier where I lubricated that contact point with grease. Now that the spring is fully in place, we can finish tightening down this screw. One thing I noticed after I got it tightened down is that there is just a little bit more contact with this spring here on that lever. So I just wanted to make sure that I got lubrication in there properly. And now we're just cleaning it up with just a little bit of Rodico. Just last thing we want is we don't want to over lubricate a watch. Less is more when it comes to lubrication, but you do need to make sure it is where it needs to be. So after we got that in and just double checking everything, we're going to install the intermediate wheel. Sometimes on these intermediate wheels, one side is the gears are kind of chamfered and cut inward. And if that is the case, you want to make sure that side is facing down, that's the side that engages the clutch wheel. On this one here, there wasn't a chamfer. So now I'm putting a little bit of grease here on the center wheel for where the cannon pinion is going to mount. And again, these cannon pinions are press fit, friction fit. So we just put it on there and just make sure it is down fully. It doesn't take a lot, but sometimes you'll hear an audible click. Sometimes you won't, but you just want to make sure that is down there. And once that's in, next we put in the minute wheel. We had lubricated that post earlier before we began assembling the keyless works. That was one of the points that we lubricated. And now we're going to put on this cover plate. This is the plate that I had cut out accidentally in the original video when I was editing it, and I didn't show the removal of this plate. One thing that's particular about this plate is that there's two screws holding it, but they're two different size screws. And I'm putting them here on the main plate just to show you. The one I'm picking up is the larger of the two. So just make sure that you're aware of that. It's not a huge deal because, they can't, they can only go in one particular spot. They won't fit in the other spot. But just be aware that there is two different screws holding this plate down. With that plate installed, now we're just applying a little bit of HP 1300 here for the hour wheel. The hour wheel just sets in place. Nothing really too complicated about it. Just make sure that the teeth mesh in correctly with that minute wheel. And now we're just going to move the motion works around a little bit. I'm just getting a feel for it to make sure that it feels correct, that nothing's binding. So we begin with the calendar works assembly. And first we are just putting in a little lubrication and installing the driving wheel. I should have put it around here. That driving wheel sits underneath the hour wheel, and you can either put this wheel in first and then the hour wheel, or just make sure it's in that proper orientation. Moving that around a little bit just to spread that lubrication around. And next we have that intermediate wheel. That's the one we shown in the earlier video where I showed the underside of that gear, where it had two steps of gears, where it interacts with both the hour wheel and the minute wheel. Next we have the date corrector, and then we have the day corrector. That is held on by one screw. Again, this calendar works is really super simple. Nothing really too complicated about it. That screw you can see there has a shoulder on it to allow that wheel to rotate freely, but still keeping it securely down. But once that is fully tightened down, I will move it around and just make sure that everything's rotating properly. You really can't test anything yet without the wheels on there, but you can just double check everything and make sure it's all correct. Now we have the day date corrector lever. This is for the quick set mechanism. So we'll lubricate that post there. A very, very, very tiny amount, but just a little bit. So that gets put in place, and then we'll lubricate the other contact point. That is that connects to that arm that that large spring interacts with. And once that's in, I'll move it around just to make sure everything's working properly, and it moves that lubrication around a little bit just to make sure it's all in place. But again, just a very tiny amount. So next, it's time to install the date jumper. We're just lubricating the pivot point for that. I'm going to set it on here, but I'm not going to set it fully in place yet because I like to apply the lubrication to the actual part itself before it's set in place, especially where the spring is. I just put a tiny little amount of grease on here, but it's just a lot easier to put that in now than when it's in place, because that spring will go flying if you're not careful. But now I'm setting that spring in place, and I'm going to put a little tool on here so it doesn't fly off when I put tension on this spring here, but we'll set that in place just like that. And finally, we'll just clean up just the excess grease with some more Rodico. And that Rodico is just the most fantastic thing ever in watchmaking. It's just, there's 101 different uses for it, and it's just great. So now I'm using just the tiniest amount of 9010 on the edge of that corrector. That's where the date wheel indexes and where it sits in its resting place. And I use a very, very, very small amount of lubrication on that. But now it's time to install the date wheel. So when you're holding these with your tweezers, don't grab it and put tension on it. Just let it fit loosely inside the tweezers where it's in the open area, inwards on the tweezers. But that way you don't mark up the ring. But once that's in, it gets set in place by getting that date corrector spring indexed in there. And now we can move on with the cover plate. And this cover plate also has the indexing spring for the day wheel. This is held on by 4 screws. When you're putting these plates in, pay very close attention to make sure that it's sitting flat. One thing I like to do is I'll get the screws started, and I won't torque them down. I'll just barely tighten them. And then if this thing sits perfectly flat, you'll know that all of the parts underneath it are in place. Nothing's moved. But every once in a while, if you see kind of one edge resting a little bit higher than the other, It's an indicator of something's kind of out of place. And then if you don't catch that now, you'll definitely catch it later when you go to put in your dial and everything else. And then all of a sudden you'll find problems. But once everything's sitting flat, we can test it out. And right now I'm just checking the quick set just to make sure that everything's moving properly. And I'll hit the quick set enough to rotate that wheel around at least one full revolution just to distribute that lubrication we set on that date corrector spring. So now we'll pull it out and put it in time setting mode and rotate the calendar works around just to make sure that the date wheel is engaging properly and that everything is working as it should. And here, there's really not a whole lot that can go wrong, but we're just making sure that the date corrector lever in the calendar works is just engaging it properly. But once that's all in, now we can put in the day wheel. And once that day wheel's in, we'll kind of get a close-up shot here. I use an oiler to set that indexing spring on that day wheel. And then once that's all done, we put the washer on there. And you can kind of see Seiko printed on that part. It says ring upward. But so you can see that the flat side of that ring, the other side is rounded, and it will snap in either direction, but you put the rounded side down. That way, when you go to remove it later for the next service, you can get underneath it to remove that. But once that's in, we just rotate that around, and I'm in setting the time just to make sure it works. And then now I'm checking the quick set on it. So on these, when you push in the crown, there's kind of two steps. When you push in the crown, the first step will move the day wheel, like you see here. And if you push it in further, it will engage the day wheel. You can't move the day wheel without moving the date, but it works. So now I loosened the dial feet screws, and now I'm installing the dial and the dial holder just as one unit. You can install them separately, but this one here, it's easy to put them in. And we're just tightening the dial feet screws. There's two dial feet screws on this, but there's only one in the video. So now we're rotating the time around till the date changes just at midnight. So when you set the hour hand and the minute hand, you want that to be at midnight or as close as you can possibly get it. So we set that out to right when the date changes, and now we're installing the hour hand. Just the more effort you put into this step to get it correct, the more it'll pay off later. Generally, you want the date to change between I have a lot of documentation out there says within 15 minutes of midnight. Generally, you can get it closer than that. But once that's in place, this is a super tight shot. This was really difficult to film, but now we're setting that hour hand here. I also use the hand tools just depending upon the watch and the hands, but we set that in place. And now I'm using a tiny bit of Rodico, and I just figured while I have this close-up shot, I'd just show just kind of the Rodico, just picking up just a tiny few microscopic pieces of dust and stuff on that dial. I mean, you would never, ever even see that when it's on your wrist, but when you're looking through a microscope, you can see it. So it drives you crazy. So now you can see I rotated the hour wheel around, and that time changed exactly at midnight. And that's just great. So now we're installing the minute hand, getting that as centered as you possibly can. And it's the exact same process here. We'll press that down, and we want to make sure that after we get it pressed down fully, that the hands are parallel to one another, that nothing's going to touch or rub. And so I'm just using this opportunity now just to kind of go over that dial once more, and just any little pieces of dirt that I see, just cleaning it up. Those two dark spots that are very visible around the 1 o'clock mark and the 10 o'clock mark, that has, I was looking at those under the microscope, and that has gone through the clear coat. So that's not dirt. That's, those marks are definitely permanent. So now we're setting the chronograph seconds wheel. This one here, you always want to make sure that you have the reset button pressed in, that you have that in the absolute 0 position the entire time you're setting that hand, and when you're pressing it down. This is just to ensure that hand resets to that position, and it's going to reset to whatever position that's in when that reset button's pressed. So always make sure when you're setting that and that sub-register hand that you have that reset wheel in place. And this little holder here I got from Vintage Time Australia. He's got an eBay store and it's great. He has a lot of specialty Seiko products. So now we're just checking the reset and everything looks great. So now we're off to the sub register hand. So again, have the reset button pushed in fully while you're setting this wheel. And it's the exact same process. And I should have noted on that seconds wheel and this one, those are just the pivots that those sit in, those are keyed. There's a flat side to it. And when those things are initially put on, it kind of cuts into the hand to kind of find its position. So you can't just, it's not just a round regular hand where you can just arbitrarily put it in any position you want. So you really got to make sure you've got it right. So take your time when you're doing these and make sure you've got it as close to the zero position as possible. With this holder, when you're setting the seconds wheel, there's a support for the rear jewel on the back of the chronograph in this particular holder, so you don't accidentally press out the jewel on the backside. On this sub-seconds hand, there is no support on the backside of that, but it also takes much less pressure to set. So just use very light pressure when you do it. So now I let this run for a little bit. I cut the video, but it looks like it's been running for 12 minutes, and I think we stop it here at what, 12 minutes and 36 seconds, 36 and a half seconds. So then we reset it. I didn't really have a good grip on it, so I'm kind of readjusting my grip here. But we'll reset it just to make sure everything goes back to zero, and they are about as spot on as I can make them, but everything looks good. So I kind of do things a little bit differently here. I like to put the movement in the case at this point for a couple reasons, which we'll get into here in a minute. But I put the movement in the case. I have a spacer underneath it right now so that the hands and the dial aren't touching the pad underneath it. But you put the pushers in, and you have to have both pushers in place, which both these pushers got new springs and new gaskets, but hold them in place, and then you can put the movement ring in. And the movement ring captures the feet on those pushers. So once you have the pushers pushed in fully, as you can see here, you can see when I release them, the feet come back, but they get caught by that movement ring. But the reason I like to mount that in there is now that this chapter ring or rotating chapter ring, I'm not sure what the technical term Seiko uses for it is, but the whole purpose of me putting the dial here is I like to have that in place when I put in the bezel, just to make sure that everything's lined up properly. Because if you don't have your 12 o'clock marker and that the color change on this Pepsi bezel between the blue and the red exactly parallel, you will definitely notice it, and it drives you crazy. But we put that ring in, and then the tension spring in, and then the ring in above it that holds the washer. So I'm going to put the not the washer, but the gasket. So we put the gasket in place for the crystal. This is a new one. I can't think of what the original material was called that Seiko used on those, but generally you don't have to replace these that much. I just happen to have one, but that 51-year-old gasket was as supple as the day it was new, which I kept it, but I'm just using the new gasket here. I've kind of had my fingers on this crystal a little bit, so I'm just giving it a good clean before we put it in place, just making sure that there's nothing on it. I use a blower and just clean the underside of it as well. But we'll set that crystal in place. Again, it just kind of presses in place. There's no tension on it right now. It's held in place with the tension when you press the bezel on. And now it's time to get the bezel installed. Again, this is exactly why I like to have the dial and the movement in place so that I can get this bezel lined up perfectly. Whenever I have a watch I'm working on where the bezel has something at the 12 o'clock position that you want to make sure is aligned right, my OCD is terrible. So any watch I look at, if whatever is at the bezel doesn't align perfectly with the 12 o'clock mark on the dial, I immediately notice it and it drives me nuts. So what you can do here, you can put a good amount of tension on the bezel. Again, it's not to the level that the press is going to put on there, but it'll hold the bezel under enough tension where it'll hold in place. And then you can rotate it around and make these really small adjustments just to get that alignment perfect. And you can kind of see me doing it here a little bit. I'm moving that back and forth where I get it set up exactly where I want it to go. So now we're going to move over to the crystal press. I've got some plastic on the underside, and I put plastic over the top where it touches the bezel, and I start to put pressure down. And when this sets in place, you'll hear a very audible click. You'll definitely know when it goes in. And right here, you'll hear it. It's always such a satisfying sound. I like that a lot. But now you can see where that the blue and the red meet right at the very top at 60 is right perfectly in line with the 12. So now we get to finish assembly of the watch, and that is the automatic work. So we're beginning by pivoting the shoulder of that pivot on the transmission wheel, getting that set in place, and that kind of just fell right in. Next, we need to put a little bit of grease here. I don't like using the grease Seiko has in its manual. I mean, you got to remember that manual's 50 years old. There are you can use those greases, but I like using the newer synthetic greases wherever possible. And capillary action will hold that magic lever to that when you turn it over. So you have those set in place, mounting that chronograph or the automatic work bridge in place, holding that in, and then I'm just kind of moving that around to make sure those pawls are on either side of that transmission wheel, and then just moving that around just a little bit just to make sure that everything's in place and it's turning the transmission wheel, and I can watch the ratchet wheel turning. So this is held on by 2 screws. Again, we get these started and tight but not torqued, just so we we don't just bind anything or get anything out of place. But once those screws are both in, I'll go and tighten them down fully. So now with the automatic work bridge fully in place, we can lubricate the transmission wheel. We just put a little spot on either side of the transmission wheel. And this is just lubrication for those pawl levers. I think the manual actually says to lubricate the pawl levers themselves. And I suppose that would work too. I like lubricating the wheel just in once spots 180 degrees apart from one another. And then just working that wheel around. I'll rotate the the bearing in both directions, but that should turn the transmission wheel in the same direction. So with that done, now we're just putting a little bit of lubrication on the bearing itself. I usually lubricate about every other ball bearing. This third one here, if I remember correctly, yeah, I put it in there, but I made a little bit of a mess there. I got some not where it should be, but we're just going to clean that up with Rodico a little bit. Not a major thing. Once that's done, we put in the rotor. The hole in the rotor is cut in a particular way. It's not just a square; it's kind of a rectangular cut with rounded edges, so it only really fits on in one particular way. So with that down, we'll just use a little plastic tool here just to kind of, that way we can tighten this down fully. I didn't really have a good spot on it, so there we go. Getting that rotor tightened down fully, and we are nearing the end. So this here is just a silicone grease applicator. Every gasket that got replaced in this watch, with the exception of the crystal gasket, which doesn't get any treatment, got treated with a silicone grease. So both the chronograph pushers, the crown or the crown stem, and this caseback gasket all get the silicone grease. With that in, we'll just put this grease on the back plate. Again, we're right in the home stretch here. So this is the exciting point. And for me personally, this is when I have to keep telling myself to kind of slow down and, not get too excited about getting it completed, because I don't want to make mistakes. But I'm just going around making sure that gasket is sitting flat, and that there's no twists in it or anything, because I just don't want to compromise its integrity. So we'll put the case back on, and I get it started here. I did tighten it down properly with the tool, but it's just not shown on video. So here, my camera battery is about to die. I didn't realize it. So you get to see me put on the first half of the bracelet. This is not the original bracelet. I didn't get an original bracelet. So this is the correct style aftermarket, but it is the exact same design as the original. And this is going to be my personal watch. And the watch itself is original, but the bracelet is not, but it is the correct bracelet for the watch. So my camera battery died, so you didn't get to see me do the rest of it, but I just wanted to show a couple pictures of the watch completed. And I really just wanted to take this opportunity just to say thanks for watching this video. Again, it's only my second video ever, but I enjoy the process of making them. Hopefully I'm going to get better at it as we move forward. But if you liked the video, I'd really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed, and thank you so much.